Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers. I'm so happy to, quote, see all of you on this chilly New York, chilly winter night, but I'm warmly greeting our speaker, Dr. Melissa Klapper from Rowan University. Before I formally introduce Dr. Klapper, I want to give you the ground rules. This is a webinar format. You are all muted and you can ask as many questions as you want, and I hope you will, in the chat. And at the end of Professor Klapper's talk, I will pose those questions to her and allow her to address issues that perhaps she didn't touch upon or expand upon issues that she's given us in her talk. Her talk tonight is funded by the Sagner Family Foundation, and its title, and you can see that on the slide, Not Just a Pleasure Trip, American Jewish Women's Travel to Mandate Palestine in the Early 20th Century. I also want to tell you that there are closed captions available. You can click on the three dots on the lower part of your screen, and also know that this is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it at a later date or review it or share it with people. I can tell you that when I posted this to various listservs that I'm on outside of Rutgers, a friend of mine said to me, "That's my mother's story." So I hope that that friend is on the webinar. I think there are a lot of people who have relatives who may be part of Dr. Klapper's extensive archival, the treasures that she has uncovered for this book, the forthcoming book. But let me just tell you something about Melissa Klapper, who is a force of nature. She is professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University. She's the author of numerous books about American Jewish women and the history of American childhood, including Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism, 1890 to 1940, which won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies, Ballet Class, and American History, books on childhood. The title is now running out of my head, unfortunately. And most recently, an extraordinary book that was started by a colleague, Diane Ashton, and which Dr. Klapper completed, called The Civil War Diary of Emma Mordechai. Dr. Klapper's talk tonight is based on a forthcoming book that she will speak more about, which should be out in the fall. And I want to just say proudly that Melissa Klapper earned her doctorate here at Rutgers. I'm old enough to remember when she was a graduate student. She was then a force of nature, and all the more so now. So I'm so happy to have her here giving this talk. Not just a pleasure trip, American Jewish women's travel to Mandate Palestine in the early 20th century. Welcome, Melissa.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so delighted to be here. Many thanks to Robin, Karen, and Nancy for helping set up this event. And of course, I'm particularly delighted to be back at Rutgers, if not in person, at least online. I had many wonderful years at Rutgers while I was earning my doctorate in American women's history, and it's a real pleasure to be back with the Bildner Center, which was not yet a thing when I first started graduate school, but came into existence while I was there. And I was lucky enough to be able to teach early on for the Bildner Center, and I'm just really pleased to be here tonight. So this talk is based on actually only one of the chapters in my forthcoming book, which will be out in the fall, which is called Jewish Women at Home in the World: Gender, Jewish Identity, and Gender, Judaism, and American Identity in the Rise of Mass Tourism. And that book, as I will discuss briefly in a moment, is about American Jewish women who traveled abroad for a number of reasons during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So tonight I'll be focusing on American Jewish women who traveled to Palestine, but the context is broader about the ways that American Jewish women moved around the world in the decades between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War II. So what I really want to focus on tonight is a few of the questions about what made travel to Palestine different than travel to other places that American Jewish women were going. One thing that is just should be immediately evident from the picture that is here on this first slide is the great excitement which with Jewish women set off for Palestine. This picture on the left, this is Hadassah Kaplan. That's Mordechai and Lena Kaplan, her parents with her. Some of you may recognize the name Mordechai Kaplan as the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. And Hadassah was setting off for a year in Palestine when her teaching job fell through in New York. She was 19, just about to turn 20, and this was a huge adventure for her. And so the rest of the evening, while I'm speaking briefly about my research and about this trip, I just want to keep the beaming faces of this family in mind. They were on the deck of the ship to see her off. She's wearing a corsage and a hat. It was a formal occasion to be setting off on a trip like this. And here she was going on a trip to Palestine that was, as the slide says, not just a pleasure trip, but something that held deeper meaning for American Jewish women who went there. Okay. Oh, my slides are stuck. Hang on a minute. There we go. There we go. Okay. So I need to speak just very briefly of the history of modern travel to put this into context. Okay, there's a few things that made travel much more accessible to many more people in the decades following the Civil War and for the next several decades thereafter. One is that in Europe in particular, where a lot of Americans traveled, not just Jewish women and men, of course, but lots of Americans, in general, there's a question of war and peace. After the Franco-Prussian War, which ends in 1871, the continent was more or less, and historians out there, please don't nitpick right now, more or less a peaceful place, especially Western Europe. And so it was safer to travel to Europe, which is where a lot of Americans wanted to go. Many Americans had a sort of inferiority complex about the United States. They thought that Europe was the place to go for culture and for art and for music, and it was a safe place to go, and so it became a very common travel destination for many Americans. So geopolitical concerns about war and peace actually had a real impact on when and whether and where Americans of all stripes traveled during these decades. And how do they travel? Well, obviously, they are not flying in airplanes, except at the very end of the period that I cover in the book, going into the 30s. Instead, they are traveling on ships, what were often called floating palaces. And this is because there's a major conversion of the technology of travel during the late 1800s, from sailing ships to steamships. And I won't get too technical with the details. There's different kinds of propellers, different kinds of things that are, you know, the engines work differently, but the bottom line is that ships became much faster than they had been before. So whereas it might take 2 weeks to travel from, say, New York to London in the earlier part of the 1860s, within 10 years, by the mid 1870s, it was taking much less time. And those of you who remember the ill-fated Titanic may recall that actually that trip was supposed to take only about 5 days between England and France, with a stop there, and into New York. And so these floating palaces were huge, basically hotels on the water. They had tremendous amenities. You could get a massage, you could get a manicure, you could work out in what was often called a Swedish gym. There were huge kitchen facilities. And so the ships became bigger, they became lighter because the materials improved, and they became much faster. And that is what enabled the rise of mass tourism during this period, where large groups of people, and not only the elite and most privileged, were able to travel. Now, if you were a Jewish immigrant in, let's say, the 1890s or the 1910s, and you were still working in a sweatshop, well, then chances were you were not going to be able to travel. But if your family was at all economically mobile upward, and if you saved and you scrimped, you might actually be able to take one trip of a lifetime. So maybe you're not summering in Europe every other year like some of the wealthier American Jews, but even working class immigrants and the children of immigrants were able to travel. And if you look at the Yiddish press from this time period, you see that there are a lot of advertisements that are aimed at this group that needed to travel in a less expensive way. Just one other thing that is involved with the technology of travel, and especially mass tourism during this time, is that in the 1920s in particular, after the US passed restrictive immigration legislation in 1921 and then again in 1924, effectively shutting down a great deal of the immigration from Europe, you had all these ships that had really been making a lot of money with their steerage compartments, which crammed immigrants in, and they scrambled. What were they going to do now that fewer immigrants were coming? far fewer immigrants were coming. And so they converted the ships and they created something called tourist class, or sometimes it was known as third class. And this was clean, comfortable, but not as luxurious as the other classes on these ships. And that also made travel cheaper and enabled more American Jewish women to travel abroad. So, what did they do when they traveled abroad? American Jewish women did many things, but there are five primary categories of reasons that they traveled. One was just basic sightseeing. I actually have two full chapters in my book about Jewish women as sightseers. One chapter is about going to the most common destinations, particularly in Europe, and including actually Russia and then the USSR after the Russian Revolution, which is when there was some travel to the Soviet Union, although it was very controlled by the Central Soviet government. And the second chapter is about less common places like Egypt, Egypt and other parts of North Africa, Latin America, and even Asia. So sightseeing, just for the sake of sightseeing, was one of the major reasons why Jewish women traveled. Another was study abroad. There were always wealthy families that sent their Jewish young ladies to finishing schools for young Jewish ladies, particularly in Germany, in order to get all the accoutrements of the young lady, and especially to study language and to meet the relatives that the families had left behind. And so study abroad was initially, for Jewish women at least, mostly for the upper Jewish class Jewish families, but eventually, starting in the 1910s and especially in the 1920s, Jewish women who went to college were often also able to study abroad in various ways. A third category was for family and home place visits, to go visit Der Alter Heim, right, to go visit the old country, to make connections with relatives, to see where parents and grandparents had come from. This also became a very popular activity, and as I said, a cross-class activity. Another reason was activism. As Nancy mentioned, I've written a book about American Jewish women involved in first wave feminism, particularly in suffrage, birth control, and peace movements. And a surprising number of American Jewish women actually traveled abroad to participate in international conferences. And there were also some Jewish women's conferences. There were two in the 1920s, meetings of the World Council of Jewish Women. And so there were both Jewish and non-Jewish activist reasons why some American Jewish women might travel. And then finally, some Jewish women went for work, especially following World War I. A huge number, well, maybe I shouldn't say huge, a very significant number of American Jewish women went abroad working for agencies like the Jewish Welfare Board or the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, which I will definitely be coming back to in a little while. There are many reasons why they might go abroad to work for some time. Now, of course, on any one trip, all of these things could happen at once. So the picture that you see here is Henrietta Zold on the left and her mother, Sophie Zold. They famously took a trip abroad in 1909 that actually checked off a number of these things. They certainly went sightseeing. Okay. They visited family and home place all over Central Europe. Both Sophie Zold, who had immigrated as a young married woman with her husband, Rabbi Benjamin Zold, they went to visit his family. They went to visit her family. Neither of them had been abroad for several decades at that point. They also then went to Palestine, which hadn't initially been on Henrietta Zold's radar, but in appreciation for all the work she had been doing, a number of her admirers back at home presented her with an extra check, actually, and with the extra money, they decided to go to Palestine as well. They also went to Turkey and to Syria. And so this is a picture of them from that 1909 trip. You sort of get a sense of how bare the built landscape was in Palestine in that period from this photo. And we'll hear more about Henrietta Zold a little bit later. So there are all these reasons why Jewish women traveled, but they're not mutually exclusive. Many trips were the same thing, covered the same ground at the same time. I have numerous diaries of American Jewish women who went abroad to attend an international conference, say on birth control, while they were in Paris. But while they were in Paris, they also went to a couture designer and had a dress made. So you could do more than one thing at the same time. So what is it that makes Palestine different as a destination? One of those things is the amount of time and money required. You could get to Europe pretty quickly. You could not get to Palestine so quickly. It was impossible during the period that I'm talking about in the early 20th century to sail directly to Palestine from the United States. You would have to go through Naples typically. So some people were able to sail directly to Naples. Others went to London or to Paris, really Le Havre first, and then to Naples. And then they would sail to either Haifa or Jaffa. Sometimes they would go from Naples to Alexandria. And then from Alexandria, they would have to take another kind of ship to get to either Jaffa or Haifa. Most ships went to Jaffa, which has a large natural port. However, you actually had to be rowed in to Jaffa, not on the larger ship that might have come from Alexandria or Naples, but on smaller boats. I can't tell you how many letters and postcards and diaries I read where people talked about how they were sure they would never see their luggage again because it was just being basically thrown off the larger ship into one of these smaller ships and then rowed to shore. It was not comfortable. You could also go overland, actually, from Alexandria through Cairo into Palestine, and there were people who did that as well. Those trains were extremely slow, but they did improve over time. So it took a longer time to get there, and the passage to go to Palestine was also significantly more expensive. This meant that most of the American Jews who went to Palestine were either tourists who had been other places in the world and wanted to go someplace different, okay, or they were going to Palestine on a particular kind of mission, and either way, they had enough money to go. Right? It was much, a regular person, so to speak, could probably save up enough to go to Europe. But a regular person would have to save up that much longer to go to Palestine. And that is something that made it quite different and a different kind of experience. It also meant that sometimes people who went there stayed for longer. I should also mention that another type of trip that was happening during this period was what was called a round the world trip. And round the world trips, which sometimes literally did go around the world, did often include Egypt and Palestine as part of those round the world trips. So that might be another way in which American Jewish women, like other travelers, would end up in Palestine and then Mandate Palestine after World War I. And the ship liners took advantage, they understood that there was something else that was very different about going to Palestine. The Cunard Line, one of the major international shipping lines of the early 20th century, advertised that a trip to Palestine is, as they put it, not merely a pleasure trip, but the fulfillment of a sacred duty. The other reason why Palestine, of course, was different is Jewishness. Is the reason that most Jews went there was for some sort of Jewish reason. Now, Jewishness could mean lots of different things. It could be religious, it could be ethnic, it could be national, it could be traditional, it could be Zionist, it could be many, many different things during this period. But it is unsurprisingly the case that most American Jews who went to Palestine went there because they were Jewish. Now, of course, there were many, many, many Christian tourists who were making the same types of trips on the same types of ships. But for many Jews, going to Palestine really was sort of the apogee of their tourism, of their sightseeing, and there was a sort of religious seriousness that was imbued into those trips. Now, the picture that you see here, okay, the woman on the woman who's in the center, right, second from the left, that's Mary Davidson of Des Moines, Iowa. Her husband, Saul, is the far right. And they're traveling with their daughter's in-laws, if you could follow that. The Yiddish traditional word for that would be machatanim. Okay, they're Mary and Saul's daughter had recently passed away, and they took this trip with her in-laws to try to get over the grief, to just go someplace else. You can see from the way they're dressed that these are fairly well-heeled couples. But I also just want to mention, right, they're not from New York, they're not from Chicago or San Francisco or some of the obvious centers of American Jewish life. They're from Des Moines, Iowa. And so when they went to Palestine, it was part of a longer trip, but they headed almost immediately to the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, as they actually refer to it themselves. And you can see here, this is actually a pretty good photo from 1924. If we were to be able to back up and see more of this image, we would see that the plaza that is currently in front of the Western Wall, for those of you who have been there, is much, much, much bigger today than it was then. So it used to, in earlier times, it was even smaller. It was really just a small, narrow, dark alleyway. By 1924, the British had, with the cooperation of both Arab and Jewish authorities, had widened it out a little bit so you could get a decent picture with good light. You'll notice that there is somebody praying traditionally, dressed in a talit, wearing tefillin, back against the wall behind them. For this couple, this was the first thing to do. Jewishness was why they were in Palestine. They went to what they thought of as the most Jewish site there. But not everybody felt that way about the Western Wall. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But Jewishness is crucial. One of the earliest people I found who kept extensive records of her trip to Palestine was Miriam Arnold. She was a wealthy widow from Philadelphia. I wish I knew more about her. We don't have that much, but we have a couple of her diaries from her round the world trip that she took as a young widow with a toddler in tow and a sister of hers as a companion. And when she went to Palestine in 1887, there was very, very little of what we now might refer to as quote unquote development. But for her, that was not the point. For her, the reason to go was absolutely religious. And what she wrote is, quote, "We are here on the holiest of ground. Every footfall is fairly upon soil trodden by patriarch and prophet. Every view was witnessed by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, by Samuel, David, and Solomon. The cities they built or where they dwelt are gone, but the mountains and valleys and rocks are all here," underlined in her diary. And so this feeling of a connection to Jewish history and to this place was very strong among many of the American Jewish women who went there. But not all of them felt the same way about it. When a woman named Rebecca Outridge Reher went to Palestine in 1929 at the end of a 4-month trip that had taken her all over Europe and to the Soviet Union, she did not appreciate the Western Wall at all. For her, she wrote, quote, "The atmosphere was medieval, charged with black magic, and not in a good way." She did not, she was actually fairly horrified by what she saw there. She saw the Jews, particularly the Zionists that she was meeting, as overzealous. She was she actually got there very shortly after the Hebron riots, in which many Jews and many Arabs were also killed. She was very uncomfortable in Palestine, and this is a cosmopolitan woman who spoke many languages and had just finished a 4-month trip. But for her, Palestine was charged with black magic. It didn't seem to her to be religiously a positive thing. So I just want to point out that not everybody who went to Palestine had the same reaction, and I don't want to paint too positive a picture. It was a complicated, complex place. There were all kinds of political issues, which I'll come back to momentarily, as you can imagine. And people left with all kinds of perspectives on what they had seen. Another thing that made Palestine different was just the sheer exoticism of it. Palestine was not the only place where this was true. Anytime American Jews went to what they considered the quote unquote Orient or the East, right, they thought of it as exotic, they thought of it as other. Here you see a picture of Mina and Henry Weil. They are from Goldsboro, North Carolina. That is not how they normally dressed, but they went to Palestine and they got dressed up like Bedouins or shepherds or whatever they thought of as the natives, what they would have referred to as the natives, who could have been either Jewish or Arab or actually Christian as well. And what's telling about this is not only that they sort of played around with the exoticism and the Orientalism by getting dressed up this way, but this is a studio photograph, meaning they went into a photography studio in Jerusalem that had the costumes there for tourists to try on and to wear. And so it was very typical for many, many Western tourists, not just from the United States, not just Jews, to see everybody in Palestine as exotic and as something from time immemorial, somehow timeless. They often preferred empty landscapes to more urbanized areas because that matched their idea of what it should look like, what the Holy Land should look like, no matter whose Holy Land we're talking about. And so this kind of exoticism was another thing that made Palestine different. Now, there were other places in the world that American Jewish women and many other Westerners went where they also felt there was this kind of exoticism. But in Palestine, it was overlaid with a Jewishness that really baffled some American Jewish tourists. They weren't, or visitors, they weren't sure how to think about everything. Like, should they be focusing on the exoticism, the Orientalism, or should they be thinking about the things that they had in common with the Jews they were meeting in this new place? So one journalist who went there in 1925 tried to reconcile this for her readers. She wrote a series of columns that were serial all over the United States trip. And she wrote, "While we like to hold fast to the camel and the donkey and the flowing robed natives to satisfy our artistic sense, yet when we realize the primitive burden these people have borne for centuries, some of our aesthetic joys must be sacrificed to make life easier and happier for the masses of people." So on the one hand, she's using that same kind of language about the primitive burden and the camel and the donkey and the flowing robed quote unquote natives. But she's also recognizing that Palestine was undergoing tremendous modernization in the 1920s. in part because of the British presence there, but also because there were all kinds of groups from every conceivable religious and national background that were trying to modernize the landscape. By 1925, there were trains, there were actually cars, a few automobiles in Palestine. There hadn't been any basic or hardly any under the Ottoman Empire that preceded the Mandate. There was more infrastructure. I'm not here to excuse British imperialism, just to be clear, right? There's big problems with the mandate system. I hope that is abundantly clear. But it is also a fact that the infrastructure improved tremendously during the 1920s. And many visitors like Sophie Irene Loeb tried to balance what they sort of wanted to see, what they thought they should be looking at, and what they were experiencing instead. However, it got uglier than Sophie Irene Loeb. When Molly Picon went to Palestine in 1933, Molly Picon, I'm sure many of you will recognize, was a star of the Yiddish stage and screen. She traveled all over the world. She performed everywhere. She performed in South Africa, in Argentina, all over South America, in the United States, all over Europe, and she went to Palestine in 1933. And the way she described it does reflect an ugliness in the way that Jewish travelers saw what was going on, or what they perceived to be going on in Palestine. So what she wrote is, quote, "When you get close to these oriental towns, there's simply a mess, hovels without any plumbing or sanitation. Millions of children are all in rags or naked. The Orient certainly needs Jews to bring the West to the East." So this kind of for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it Jewish chauvinism and a Western chauvinism about what needed to happen in Palestine was also shared by many American Jewish women who went there. Now, a few minutes that there were also a lot of women who did not feel this way and who did not differentiate between the needs of different groups based on religion or based on sort of East versus West. But it is a fact that there were some who really saw any what they considered to be any positive modern development, they credited almost exclusively to Jews and particularly to Zionists. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of conflict over tourism in Palestine. So one of the things that happened is that different groups had different tour guides, and they gave very different kinds of tourist experiences to different groups of people. Catholic tourists who went on pilgrimages might have seen very different sorts of things than might have, let's say, wealthy Egyptians who were going to Palestine to look at the sites, or Americans who were there. And there was a lot of tension within the tourism industry as it was developing during this period. Now, another thing that was happening in Palestine, especially after World War I, when the mandate is going into effect, even before the mandate goes into effect, is that there's a lot of Jewish communal work in post-World War I Palestine. Palestine had been, it was an Ottoman territory, and during the war, the Turkish government and the Ottoman Empire actually exiled a significant number of relatively recent, what they considered to be Zionist newcomers, even those who had actually already been there for a generation or two. They actually forced them to go to Alexandria in Egypt during the war. Palestine was effectively shut off from the charitable contributions that it had been getting from Europe and from the United States and elsewhere. And the situation in Palestine was quite dire during World War I for everybody, not just for Jews, for everybody. There was just widespread disease, starvation. It was not a pleasant place to be during the war. Very difficult times. And there were huge numbers of orphans left after the war. And the Joint Distribution Committee that I mentioned before, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC, set up Jewish orphanages to help care for these for a lot of these children. I know it's probably hard to read, but the caption in the photo on the right says "Children in Jerusalem receiving extra food." And you'll notice that there are some Western dressed looking nurse types who are in these photos, and a lot of them were American Jewish women who went to Palestine in order to take care of children and other Jewish communal needs. One woman who was in charge of this immediately after the war for the Joint Distribution Committee was Alice Seligsberg. Alice Seligsberg was actually already there. She left for Palestine almost immediately when the war ended. She was in charge of the American Zionist Medical Unit, which was a project sponsored by Hadassah to send doctors, nurses, dentists, and public health officials to Palestine to help with the greatly needy population and all kinds of population. I want to be clear that Hadassah's medical efforts now and then were open to everybody. And Alice Seligsberg actually wrote to someone that when she took over the Jewish orphan care in Palestine, quote, "I shall regard this opportunity for the service as the greatest that could ever come my way." She lived in Palestine for almost 3 years in order to carry out this work and to help take care of orphans in particular. And there was a real concern what was going to happen. And there was also a push in Jewish communities around the world to send Jewish orphans to Palestine where they could contribute in quote unquote building up the land because of the devastation that had been wrought after the war, during and after the war in many parts of Europe. There was even, just to demonstrate how travel helped make the Jewish world and the Jewish diaspora draw closer together in an era of mass movement that wasn't only migration, that could also just be travel. There was a community, a Jewish community in Durban in South Africa that sponsored almost 100 Jewish orphans from Ukraine to go to Palestine where they could be cared for and educated and brought up to be part of the Zionist initiatives there. So there's a huge, the idea that there's correspondence and then people moving around between South Africa and Poland and Palestine just gives us an example of how travel helped enable and bring together the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the years after World War I. And then I want to talk briefly about the gendered politics of tourism in Palestine, because there was a lot of conflict not only between Jewish tourism and the way the Jewish tourism infrastructure was operating, and either Christian or Muslim infrastructure, but also within Jewish tourism, unsurprisingly, I guess. But this kind of the Zionist authorities in Palestine created its own tourist bureau starting in 1925. But Hadassah, which already had a presence in Palestine and had since its first nurses settlement in 1913, which was staffed by two American Jewish women who are in my book, Hadassah didn't like what had been set up. First of all, they didn't like the fact that this new Zionist tourism bureau was only taking people to Jewish sites. They thought that was a huge mistake. They thought that people needed to see all the sites. Yes, they wanted to bring them to Hadassah locations and to show off what Hadassah was doing and hopefully publicize Hadassah and fundraise. But they also believed that you couldn't understand Palestine without seeing the full gamut of all the different people who were living there. And so they started their own tourist bureau the same year. They had tourist representatives at all the major cities, and any place where there was a Hadassah clinic or a hospital or some kind of Hadassah institution, they had local on site who would be willing to do tours of those sites. So what you're looking at here is a 1934 brochure that shows where all the places where Hadassah had some kind of institution. These were all places where if you were to flip over this brochure, you would get phone numbers actually, and you'd be able to see who you could get in touch with. And it was women in charge of all of this. Right. Hadassah in general, and this is a much longer story I can't tell here, but it worked very hard to preserve its independence as a women's organization, and the way that they ran their tourism activities in Palestine was just another example of that. And they weren't shy about talking about the differences. So Irma Levy Lindheim, who was one of the earlier presidents of Hadassah, and actually herself later made Aliyah, she immigrated to Palestine, she wrote, quote, "Heretofore, in this man-run world of ours, men have gone into a country to conquer it, but our women have said this colonization is unlike any other. When we went into Palestine, Hadassah went in with her hand outstretched. Hadassah went in with a healing, kindly, humanitarian spirit and said it did not make any difference if they were Hebrew, Arab, or Christian." Now, of course, she's trying to make a point about Hadassah. This is a very sunny view in general of, quote, this colonization. But my point here is more that American Jewish women really felt that their activity, particularly through Hadassah in Palestine, was different than what had happened before. It was politically different, it was religiously different, and they tried to be they made all their medical and educational facilities open to everybody, particularly the medical facilities, actually. And that was a very important difference between the other kinds of development that were happening elsewhere. It also made the British mandate officials pretty interested in working with Hadassah. So they had a sort of mutually beneficial relationship, while many Hadassah leaders actually were pacifists and really deplored imperialism on the macro level. On the micro level, on the ground, they were willing to work with the official. That meant that they could get better facilities in their hospitals and in their clinics. And Henrietta Zold, who we remember you saw in 1909 when she took her first trip to Palestine, In 1920, she went back, and she was there as on official business to help develop the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, and to work for the Jewish Agency. She was particularly tasked with education and healthcare, which, as the founding president of Hadassah, used to, she didn't she was going to stay there. She was in Palestine from 1920 to 1923, went back to the United States. She was already an older woman at that point and thought she'd live out the rest of her days with the family that she had in the US, but she was called back to Palestine in 1927 again to take over education and healthcare for the Jewish Agency in the Yishuv, and she stayed there then. She then lived in Palestine the rest of her life, although she went back and forth a fair amount. And for her, it was so gratifying to see different American Jewish women, and particularly Hadassah leaders, coming. She wrote, "There has been an almost uninterrupted succession of Hadassah leaders visiting here for the last year and a half. The connection between Palestine and America becomes more and more intimate year after year." And the thing is, what surprised me, and this is, where I'll end, and we'll make sure we have time for questions, but something that really surprised me when I started this project was that I knew, of course, that American Jewish women went to Palestine. I knew all about Henrietta Zoll, or so I thought. I found out more. I knew about some of the people who had famously been there. But what I didn't know, and what I would argue nobody has known until the kind of research I did for this book in 19 different archives in multiple languages, is that way more American Jews went to Palestine than anybody has ever realized. It was a very significant number. Now, it's not as many as those who are going to Paris or to London or to Rome. I'm not going to say that. But it is a very, very significant number. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds every year, starting in as early as the 1880s. And you can trace it if you look at the kinds of primary sources I love to look at: diaries, travel journals, letters, scrapbooks, photographs, all this kind of material. You really can get a sense of what changes there, but also the constant commitment that really a very significant number of American Jews have in going to Palestine. For some, it's really religious. It's a religious mission. It's not actually that different than the Christian pilgrims who are also going to Palestine in greater number as the infrastructure for tourism improves. For some, it's actively about Zionism. For some, there are also plenty of American Jews who are actively and loudly anti-Zionist who still go to Palestine. Mina and Harry Weil, I'll just go back to their picture for a minute. They're from Goldsboro, North Carolina. They were actively and very vocally anti-Zionist. So why did they go to Palestine? Because they were Jewish. And so they didn't have to agree with everything that was going on there, and they didn't. But for them, the reason to go to Palestine was because whether you're Zionist or not, there was a connection. There's a biblical connection. There's, centuries old, millennia connection to the land. That's how they felt about it. And so that's why they went. I found several cases where American Jewish women actually came back from Palestine with some of the soil. They actually brought back some of the land with them in little bottles. And I can tell you, there's no place else that American Jewish women went where the soil, the land itself, had that kind of import for them. The Jews who went to the Soviet Union in the 30s, a whole other story, did feel a kind of, especially if they went to the Jewish agricultural colonies, did feel something for the land, but it wasn't sort of holy or significant to them in the same way. So there really were differences. Right. There were also American Jews who went there for professional reasons, just as was the case for American Jewish women traveling other places. They were nurses, they were doctors, they were social workers, they went to live on kibbutzim, on agricultural settlements. So there's all these reasons why American Jewish women went in fairly large number. And as they did that, they became part of a much larger wave of American Jewish women who, by traveling around the world, brought Jewish communities into closer contact with each other. They were particularly interested wherever they went, including in Palestine, in the status of women wherever they went. So many of the personal narratives that I read in these primary sources, they talk about the women wherever they go. And that's just as true in Palestine and anywhere else, and actually even more true because they felt a kind of connection to Jewish women, even to Jewish women who are from cultures that seemed very unlike theirs. So they sometimes put that in pretty negative terms, as we have seen just briefly even from this presentation. But even when they were being negative about these, Oriental or, primitive peoples, they still felt that connection. Now, of course, there were other groups of people, women and men, going to Palestine during this period who had similar reactions to, within their own group. So I'm not going to say that American Jews and American Jewish women were completely exceptional, but what is exceptional is the way that Jewish travel, a period of mass migration, was another form of mobility that brought together Jewish communities from all over the world. And the sheer number of American Jewish women who traveled, including to Palestine, really changed the shape of the Jewish world during the late 1800s and early 1900s. They took advantage of the technology that made the world at least a little bit smaller. They went all over the world. They had new experiences. They became more cosmopolitan. They loved what they saw. They also dissed what they saw. They really, in looking at them, we really get a sense of what a world on the move was like in these decades, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And for this, in focusing on Palestine, allows us to see the special way that Jewishness suffused that travel, and that's taken to sort of the nth degree for American Jewish women who went to Palestine during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So I'll thank everybody, and I'm going to be very happy to answer some questions. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, but I'll just leave this up for just a moment. But I'm really excited to present some of this. This is a project I worked on for a long time and in archives all over the country. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. The first book on your slide to the right was your dissertation book, and you can bring that up. Well, I guess you won't now, but Melissa has had a really capacious view of American women's history and Jewish women's history, and really has expanded the field enormously. We're so pleased to count you as one of our proud graduates. There are quite a few questions. I think let's just start with the sources, because I think not so much you take for granted, but the historian's craft as an archival historian is quite distinct, requires enormous amounts of work, a lot of wading through materials, not always finding gems, but it usually takes a long time. So can you tell us a little bit about your method? How you found your sources, what did it mean? You mentioned 19 archives, but were they online? Did you go places? What were you looking for? How did you search for this material? Because I know you found tons of stuff. So how'd you do it?
So let me just back up for 1 second to say how I came to this project to begin with. I noticed even when I was writing my dissertation, these many years ago, that some of the Jewish girls I was writing about traveled abroad. And I thought, interesting. And then when I was writing my book about American Jewish women's activists, I found a lot of these women went abroad. And I thought, maybe there's something here. And so it was actually, in a way, I'm writing, some of the people in this new book are people I've been writing about for 30 years at this point. I feel like I know them. This is actually a trap historians should not fall into, but I do think of some of them as like my women because I feel like I know them so well. Certainly I've read more of their stuff, and I'm pretty safe in saying anybody else. So I had some places to start from. I knew about some trips I knew about some particular trips. I was familiar with the papers of some women, and I wasn't actually sure initially if there would be enough for a book. I thought, maybe an article or two, we'll see what happens. But then it turned out that every archive I went to, and I did go to all of them but one. Okay, some of you may or may not be aware that a lot of archival material is not digitized. Like, not everything is online. Right? And the vast majority of the kind of material I always work with is not online. It's in archives. You have to go there. There was one exception for this book, which was great during COVID. It was the only research I could do for 2 years, which was horrible. And so I went a lot of places. The American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati and the American Jewish Historical Society in New York are always sort of first, for people doing American Jewish history, those are the first places you go. But I also did research. I wanted this to be a national story and not to only talk about the obvious communities, particularly New York. So I also went to San Francisco. I went to South Carolina and North Carolina. I went to Chicago. I went to Baltimore. I went to Boston. And every place I went, I found just a tremendous amount of material, which further sort of proves that a lot of American Jewish women went abroad. The thing about archives is that anything in an archive has been somewhat serendipitously saved from what I like to think of as the proverbial dustbin of history. Somebody saved that. That's why it's there. But travel materials often got saved because they were unique and unusual in a family. Even someone who never kept a diary before, likely someone gave that person a diary to take on her trip, and she often kept a diary and then kept it. and then it would just get passed down to the family and eventually get into an archive. Somebody would donate it. I would in the past I've actually encountered
Hold it, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure why. Oh no, some technology glitch, Melissa. One second. One sec. I don't know if you can hear me. Your internet, one second. Mhm. Can you try again? Can you speak now?
Yeah, is this better? I don't know what
Yeah,
happened.
something just flipped out for a second. So, yeah.
Okay. Apologies to everybody. I'm sorry, you can't control the internet gods. Okay, I hope that doesn't happen again, but please let me know if it does.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I had some particular people to look for, and then I just went from there. It's a kind of snowball effect. Every place I went, I looked for travel as a search term in a catalog. But even if I found something in a catalog, I still had to go to the archive. And so I also got very interested in the material culture, the actual scrapbooks and the photos. And so that's sort of the method here. But I am just throughout my career, I am what I think some people would call a deep dive archival researcher. And I did
Right.
some research in Yiddish. My Yiddish is not as good as it was a few books ago. I looked at the Yiddish press in particular because I was interested in the way that, for instance, Jewish travel agencies in major American immigrant communities, like in Chicago and New York, were advertising and arranging trips to go back to the homeland. And so I wanted to look into that too, because I was really committed to not only writing about middle and upper class women.
Right. Right. There's we have a historian colleague at McGill who's done some marvelous work on these travels where you could go back to the old country, meaning go to Poland, and then you could go to Palestine. It's kind of like
Right,
like it was a package deal, and she's
right.
found extraordinary material about that. So thanks for that. I mean, everyone like myself and you who work in archives, you don't know what you're going to find, and then you
Right.
find things serendipitously, and then one person might mention another, and that will lead you elsewhere. I'm tempted to ask you more about the material culture, but I'm not going to do that right now because I want to give our audience, we had quite a few questions. So this wonderful question. Do you have any thoughts or observations on how these trips to Palestine affected the life or participation of women when they came back to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, there's a larger question about how travel in general affected people's lives thereafter, but Palestine is a little different. A lot of people who went to Palestine when they came home got more involved in Jewish life than they had been before. Not across the board, but it was not unusual at all. For one thing, because fewer American Jews, were going to Palestine than other places. When they got back, if they lived in any kind of sizable American Jewish community, they were often invited to give talks, to show pictures, to show things that they might have brought back, like arts and crafts from the Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts in Jerusalem. They very often gave talks, whatever their political commitments might have been. It was a very common thing to happen. And so that they then ended up being sort of experts on something that in their community that they might not have known about before. The Jews who went who were already Zionist usually came back more committed to Zionism than before. Not always. There were people who were unhappy with various things they saw and were less involved, but I'd say the overwhelming majority. There were Jews who were anti-Zionist who came back Zionist. That happened. Sophie Irene Loeb, I had a quote from her when she went in 1925. She was kind of agnostic. She wasn't Zionist, and she wasn't even that involved in the American Jewish community. It was the New York World that sent her to Palestine to report on the opening of Hebrew University and then to stay there for a while.
Of
And
course.
she and actually compiled those articles into a book that she then when she turned over all her profits from that book to the Jewish Agency afterward. But there were also people like Rebecca Arich-Reher, whom I also quoted, who started off anti-Zionist and came back even more convinced that it was a bad idea and wrote a series of very anti-Zionist articles that she published afterwards. So people did have different reactions, but I'd say the average person probably came back feeling more connected to Jewishness and to this than they had before once they had seen it in person. Even though they did not have blinders on, a lot of them could see there were problems, right? There were clear and evident problems. There were, it, I think I'll just leave it at there. There were problems, as you can imagine, and that those
Well,
were,
you know what? I actually want to ask you more about that because this is obviously a moment
yeah,
in general where, knowing and not knowing or perceptions, and, you've used words rightly, colonialism, imperialism, these are very hotly contested words today.
yeah,
You know, often misunderstood, but
yeah,
on the other hand, there is reality to it. So, and like many people, I know other people's grandparents went in these years, and it's they're finding diaries, and sometimes they're mortified about what they found, sometimes they're heartened by what they found. So, I mean, can you generalize about the honesty with which your travelers saw the complexities on the ground? Or, I mean, perhaps you can't generalize because it's probably person to person, but yeah.
yeah. I think it's a little hard to generalize. I mean, there were people who went. There was a woman named Agnes Goldman who was a bacteriologist, a young woman, and she went with the Red Cross to Palestine during World War One, actually, and she was sort of down on being Jewish. She thought Judaism was a dead letter in general. She had studied abroad in Europe. She was not interested, and she was definitely not Zionist. She had to go through Alexandria and was very taken aback by how all the Zionists who had been exiled during the war just couldn't understand why she wasn't Zionist. She had negative reaction to that. When she got there, she didn't turn into a Zionist overnight, and she was very unhappy with what she foresaw would be the problems with the British promising the same thing to two different groups of people. She was aware of that as a Red work, but she also wrote about the natural beauty of the land, which is something that we haven't talked about that much, but that did have an impact on a lot of travelers. And you see that in Christian pilgrims' accounts of their trips during the same period, that they liked the land in part because they perceived it as empty, which is a problem because it wasn't empty. But they also, the landscape and the Agnes Goldman just said she couldn't deny the agricultural work that these settlements had done to, I'm going to use the word improve the land. That's a little bit of a weighted word. But so the people really did have different kinds of reactions. There were, Hadassah, I should say, early on, Hadassah encouraged its members who were coming to Palestine to study not only Hebrew, but Arabic. They offered some Arabic classes even. As I said, the Hadassah medical facilities were always open to everybody. Hadassah gave history classes, not a standard Zionist narrative at the time. So there were just so many different ways to do Palestine and to appreciate it and to see it. And then there were also people who went there, usually as part of a larger tour, who weren't impressed at all. They thought the hotels were terrible and the food was awful and why isn't there enough water? And get me out of here. Cairo is much more sophisticated. Let's go on to Beirut. Time to move. But they did also, the other thing I will just mention here is that what is striking is that a lot of American Jews, women and men both, who went to Palestine did not only go to Jewish sites. If they're in Jerusalem, they went to the Western Wall, but they also went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they also went to the Mosque of Amman, which was then available to tourists. So they didn't only do Jewish stuff, which is also kind of telling. So the complexity was there. I think it depended a little bit on the individual to make of it what they would.
Great. So there's another question that someone asked, and which is you touched on, then I'm going to, and two things that you riffed on here that I want to. So someone wanted to know, where did they stay? What were the accommodations
Yeah.
like? They didn't have TripAdvisor. So like, how did it happen? What was the relationship between the hotelier and the travel companies? How did that work? What did you find
Well,
out?
so what's fascinating is the earlier part. I had a quote from Miriam Arnold, who went to Palestine in 1887. In 1887, there were no hotels, period. So you basically did what we now today would call glamping. They had tents, they had canvas tents. They had these huge entourages. Everybody would have a tent that was made out of some kind of heavy canvas sheeting. The water was carried around in reused standard oil cans because that was what was available to move things around. For every one or two tourists, there would be a whole bevy of usually Arab, sometimes Bedouin people on donkeys who were providing the labor, and they just traipsed up and down the lane. They walked and they rode donkeys and they stayed in tents. So that, I mean, that's the earlier part of the period that I'm looking at, and through really through about 1900, that's what you would get when you went there. There were a few hotels, and then there, more and more sort of sprang up over time. But there's a lot of complaints about the hotels or the Young Men's Christian Association and the Young Women's Christian Association, where a lot of people stayed. There were droughts. There was no sewage system in Jerusalem, through a lot of this period. And so this was a real shock to a lot of Western tourists. The other thing that's kind of funny is that even after World War One, where there are more hotels and hotels of different kinds. So by then you could stay at the King David. That was for the very wealthy people. If you didn't want to be around a lot of Jews, you could stay at the American Colony Hotel, which was founded by a Christian, just a Christian group. Let's just leave it at that for now. But that was not where very many Jewish people stayed if they wanted to be in community with other Jews. And there also were mid-level hotels. What was hard to find in hotels, ironically, was kosher food. And so what you find in the 1920s is that kosher travelers to Palestine sometimes had trouble finding places to stay where they could eat. It's a kind of that, which demonstrates the wide range of tourists that were coming to Palestine during this period.
Right. So, I mean, in so many ways, it shouldn't surprise us, right, that the Zionist revolution, which at least in its beginnings is a secular revolution, nonetheless, in time is going to Judaize Palestine and
Yeah.
make it hospitable to a certain kind of orthodoxy or observance, which would, and even you mentioned now Dome of the Rock is off limits, right? But wasn't back in the day.
Yeah.
Great. So the other question I want to ask, which you actually alluded to, was, Cairo was more interesting, Beirut was more interesting. So how did your travelers, because we did ask you to speak specifically about Mandate Palestine. Your book is about women in the world, Jewish women at home in the world, but I think it's fascinating today because we don't get it that this was a region and people could go what are now seeming like impenetrable borders
Yeah.
were not. So can you tell us a little about your women's experiences in, the Paris of the Middle East, Beirut or Cairo or Alexandria? Like what did they have to say about those places?
So, and they also, and Constantinople is actually another, place where a lot of people went. And in fact, when Henrietta Szold and her mother took their trip in 1909, they decided not to do the sailing route from Naples, let's say, or even Alexandria. They decided to come in overland through. They went to Turkey, and then they came in through Syria and Lebanon because they wanted to see the quote unquote Oriental context of Palestine as they were going into it. So people were savvy even then. Like and I think with a little bit of, when Henrietta Szold writes this, there's a little bit of ironic, meaning there. Like she understood that she was being kind of, Orientalist, we would call it. They really enjoy. A lot of Jewish women enjoyed these other places, but they definitely saw them as exotic. There was an east versus west divide. Palestine is on the east side of that, but so are all these other places that you just mentioned. Anything that had been in the Ottoman Empire and further east. And I also am writing about Jewish women who went to Asia, and which was even more so, because they couldn't. The language barrier there was just, could not be overcome. Right? You had to travel differently in Japan and in China during the period. So, but they felt they were particularly focused on a lack of what they saw as modern amenities. So even women who kind of knew better and even were laughing at themselves often complained about the bathroom facilities, especially in the so-called East. But they also commented a lot on women. They were very interested in gender norms in these different places. They were very interested in women's status. They saw many of them as being sort of drudges and completely oppressed as opposed to their own enlightened Western, freedom. And they were very explicit about that in letters they wrote home and in things like that. So they really were very interested in women. And actually, one of the women I wrote about went to Constantinople. Well, actually, it was already Istanbul by then, in 1927, and she was disappointed to see that the women were dressed in such modern garb. Of course, this was part of the modernization project of the new nation of Turkey under Ataturk, but for this woman, it was very disappointing. She was expecting to see, Oriental, clad women, and instead she's getting women who probably got all their clothes in Beirut, in Damascus, or possibly even in Paris, depending on their status.
Right.
So there's a gender awareness that's very interesting. And I just want to say, I saw this question in the chat, so I'm just going to say that I'm writing about women who traveled alone, with friends, with family members, with men, in tourist groups, right? So although my focus is on women, I have quite a bit of material from men too in the book. First of all, they were traveling with the women on the same trips, and it can be fascinating to read this, letters from two different people on the same trip. And men did have a somewhat different take. Not always, but they were much less likely. They were not commenting on the status of men, for instance, or the status of women very often. They were less interested in gender issues. They wrote much less about clothing, and they wrote less about food. Those are the overall like the differences. It's not to say that they never said anything about food or clothing, but they
Right.
were less focused on the issues that were seen as traditionally feminine, like clothing and food, than
Yeah,
women's
yeah.
accounts overall.
It's really fascinating. So I guess the last question, which would lead, sort of goes back to your other work. So one person asked, did these experiences change their relationship to the Jewish community? So the next question, again, which leads back to your earlier work or some of your work on Jewish women's on activism, to what degree did their sort of gender lens inform then their activism or not on behalf of what we might call feminist issues or women's issues when they returned to the United States? Did you see those connections?
I did sometimes, but I think that a lot of the women who were activists were already activists before they traveled. I mean, for some of them, the whole reason to travel was activist, right? That this is why
Right.
they're going to other places. They're establishing connections and networks. The World Council of Jewish Women met in Vienna in 1923 and in Hamburg in 1929, and that was a way to bring Jewish women of all different countries together, particularly those in 1923, especially those who had lately been fighting each other, right? Whose nations had been fighting each other. They really worked hard to get German and French and Italian and British women, all in the same room. Um, I do think I think that younger women who traveled and had these experiences did sometimes. I think I'm not going to use the term radicalized. That might be too strong. But they did come back with more awareness of the world and current affairs and the different situations of different people. It did open their eyes to a wider world than what they had been in. So younger women, I do think, were more likely to have an experience of travel that would lead them to then get involved in something when they got back. Older women, by which I mean people my age and younger than that, like middle age and whatever, and older women who were already had causes, sometimes were traveling specifically. So Rebecca Aurich Reher and her traveling companion, Seti Swartz Kuhn, who set off in 1929, everywhere they went, they made arrangements in advance to meet with a women's group there. The only place they couldn't find anybody was in Damascus. Rebecca wrote in her diary, no feminists available or something like that. But everywhere they went, they did that. These were people, they had been suffrage activists, they were pacifists, they had networks. And so it's not only Jewish networks that were being invoked as American Jewish women were traveling, it was other kinds of networks as well, including feminist activist networks. And that's something, even if a woman herself was not hugely involved, likely she knew somebody who might know somebody who could connect her with somebody when she traveled. And so there really is a lot of networking going on here that is true for the Jewish world, but also true for activist women.
Terrific. Well, I think, on the one hand, I always say, and I'm sure you do too, to your students, don't assume that the world that you're
Right.
living in is similar to the world of the past. But the flip side of it is don't think that you invented the wheel, right?
Yeah.
So, when we think about young people traveling now and they're discovering this and they're discovering that, but these were intrepid, plucky.
Yeah.
Some of them were activist oriented, some of them, were just explorer types. And it was a different world of travel, but they set out and they were, as you said, at home in the world. I love that phrase. And the world was there, their world was theirs to discover. And of course, the technology of the moment was trains and boats. But, then we have in the immediate post-war years, which I know your book doesn't deal with, the beginning of air travel, which is
Right.
going to change everyone's lives, like the ability to get on a plane and cross the ocean in 8 hours kind of thing. So thank you so much, Melissa. It was, as always, wonderful to listen to you. And I think, we had a lot of people online, fantastic. So I know that in person is always better, but given the weather, I think we made a very good choice. I want to thank, of course, our staff, Karen Small, Robin Auerbach, Sarah Portilla. None of this could happen, Darcy Marr, without all of the work that goes on behind the scenes. I want to thank you. I want to congratulate you on the forthcoming book. I did put it in the chat. So if you are interested in more all the other chapters, please look at the NYU Press catalog. Just Google Melissa Klapper. You will find all of her books. You should read all of her books. And again, I am a proud member of the history department at Rutgers, so I'm thrilled that we can count you as our own. And many of my colleagues remember you as a graduate student. We're so pleased that you were coming to talk. And I want to tell everyone out there that when the weather gets a little warmer, my colleague in the history department, Jochen Helbeck, is giving what will be, I think, a really fantastic talk, like tonight's, on his new book called World Enemy Number One: Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews, which is a focus on the Eastern Front of the war and on the German campaign against Judeo-Bolshevism, which he believes is really the motor force of the horrors that take place in what we now call the Holocaust, meaning from 1941 plus. And that will be at the Douglas Student Center on March 23rd. And of course, I hope to, be in touch with all of you in cyberspace through other ways. And of course, for next year's programming, thank you again, Melissa. And I look forward to seeing you in person very soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.